Imagine you're a parent of a child that just turned 18. Would you immediately cut off your child from support just because they're now legally an adult? Well, this is essentially what the government does to young people in foster care as soon as they turn 18 or 21, depending on the state. This leaves them scrambling to find housing, employment, pay for tuition, and meet basic needs, often without a trusted adult to help or even provide emotional support. Those working in the foster care system, including our guests today, refer to this experience as a support cliff. What types of supports and services do foster youth need as they transition into adulthood? How can we improve current practices and policies to set them up for success during this critical time in their lives? This is Among Us, a podcast from UCLA's Center for the Transformation of Schools that unpacks the often invisibilized experiences of students. Today's guests help us to understand the experiences of foster youth who are going through a process called aging out of the system. Every year, about 20,000 foster youth between the ages of 14 to 21 transition from adolescence to adulthood. This is a transformation not only in terms of brain development, just like the rest of their peers, but also the practical reality of moving out of foster care and into independent living. Their outcomes are grim. Only half graduate from high school, and 25% are incarcerated within 2 years of aging out. Our guests today shed light on this specific population of foster youth and how we can improve these outcomes. Let's hear more. Our first guest, Dr. Amy Dworsky, has committed her scholarship and career to researching transition-age foster youth. She's currently a senior research fellow at Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago, a research and policy center that focuses on children, youth, and families across a number of different areas, including child welfare, early childhood, juvenile justice, and education. Amy worked with foster care researcher Mark Courtney on what's referred to as the Midwest Study, where they found that young people who have access to foster care until 21 were more likely to pursue higher education, as opposed to young people who aged out of care at 18. Now, pursuing higher education may not be in every young person's journey, and we acknowledge that. But when we look at the research, higher education provides long-term positive benefits and outcomes, like better employment opportunities, higher earnings, better health outcomes, and increased civic engagement. Amy shares the importance of stable and affordable housing availability as a foundation for success in other areas of life, and advocates for foster youth support to be tapered off over time instead of abruptly ending at an arbitrary age. Let's listen to her discussion with CTS Executive Director, Dr. Joe Bishop.
Welcome to Among Us. I'm excited to have with us today Dr. Amy Dworsky from Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago. Amy, welcome. Welcome to today's show.
Thank you.
Amy, what does that mean when you say aging out?
So most children who enter foster care are eventually returned home. And those who aren't returned home often exit via adoption or legal guardianship. But there are some children and youth in foster care who never find permanency. And these are the young people who age out. They stay in foster care until they're legally too old, and then they're discharged.
And what age is that?
That varies somewhat depending on what state they're in. Right now, in most states, young people have an opportunity to stay in foster care to age 21. There are still some states where the age is still 18.
What are the implications for different age limits depending on the states? What does that mean for our country?
Sure. So there's been some research, particularly out of California. There's a study led by Mark Courtney that suggests that allowing young people to stay in foster care until age 21 leads to better outcomes in a number of different areas. We actually found similar results in a study that I worked on with Mark in the Midwest. This study followed young people aging out of foster care from Illinois, Iowa, and Wisconsin. And again, we saw better outcomes across a number of domains for young people who were able to stay in foster care to 21.
Tell us a little bit more about that work. So, what were the main findings for staying connected, essentially?
Mm-hmm.
And then why do you think those findings are significant when you think about, I think intuitively people would probably think, okay, if you have a support system, you're probably going to be more successful. But tell us a little bit more, Amy.
Yeah. So in the Midwest study in particular, we found that young people in Illinois, where they could stay in foster care until 21, were much more likely to pursue post-secondary education than young people in Wisconsin or Iowa, where the age limit was 18.
Mm-hmm.
And clearly, pursuing post-secondary education has a number of benefits, particularly with respect to employment and earnings. There's also some research suggesting that post-secondary education is associated with better health outcomes and actually more civic engagement. So there's a number of reasons why staying in foster care that allowed young people to pursue post-secondary education and that hopefully will lead to better outcomes in other domains as well.
I saw in 2006, based on your research, there was 24,000 young people who age out for our country. Is that a larger number today, or is it about the same?
The number has gone down a bit. Between 19 and 20,000 young people are aging out each year now. I think in part that somewhat reflects the smaller size of the foster care population in general. The number of children in foster care has gone down a bit over the past couple of decades.
And in terms of the characteristics too, for young people who age out, we know the foster population is mostly young people of color, and that those are the similar characteristics for older students as well?
That's correct. Disproportionately young people of color.
And you've done some work examining barriers to post-secondary education and even thinking about, how do we improve outcomes for college age, we could say college age foster youth.
Yeah.
What are you finding, and what should listeners know?
So I think young people in foster care with respect to post-secondary education face a number of different barriers. Some of those barriers are financial. Young people just don't know how to pay for college. There are a number of programs, both at the federal and state level, to help them pay for college and university, but sometimes they're not aware of those programs. And then there's barriers that are non-financial. Some of these are barriers related to lack of preparation for college. We know that young people in foster care often change schools because their placements change, so their education gets disrupted. We also know that they tend to be enrolled in lower performing schools where maybe they're not receiving the highest quality education that they could. Even when they do go to college, they're often entering behind their peers academically, and so they're struggling. And then I think there's also more of a social component that young people often don't have adults in their lives to provide them with the kind of guidance that would help them navigate college. I think that's also a struggle, that they come from families where going to college was not the norm. They weren't exposed to campuses when they were growing up. So it's just a very foreign experience to them. And they don't have the supports they need to help them navigate that.
And when you think about what's the role of colleges and universities in supporting young people to successfully matriculate or complete their degree and move on to a family-sustaining job, like what is the role of colleges and universities, Dr. Dworsky?
Yeah, so a number of colleges and universities across the country, and actually a growing number, have either campus support programs or college success programs. And these are programs really designed to provide young people who've experienced foster care with sort of wraparound services and support. So these could be academic supports, they could be social supports, they could be mental health services, they could be housing. So all of the types of things that a young person would need to be successful.
Our center did a study looking at campus support programs in the California State University system, and we found that a lot of these programs vary from campus to campus.
Yes.
Historically, they're very underfunded, sometimes understaffed, and it seems like sometimes campus support programs are supposed to be the kind of the one-stop shop or catch-all for for everything to address some of these barriers that you've addressed that begin much, much before students become college age. So how do we ensure that campus support programs are successful? More broadly, how do we ensure that colleges and universities better support young people who've aged out of the foster system?
Yeah, I think you're right about programs being underfunded and overburdened. I think that's certainly a challenge. I actually think California is doing one of the best jobs right now in terms of these programs. My understanding is that you have programs on pretty much every public campus across the state, which is not something we see in most other states. Also, the point you made about the fact that these young people are facing challenges that started much earlier in their lives. So I think we really need to be looking way before college and making sure these young people are getting the preparation they need in high school and even earlier so that when they get to college, they're college ready.
Absolutely. And you write a lot about how your research can inform policy change. What are a few things you think need to change now to move forward?
I would say one of the biggest issues that young people aging out are facing right now is around housing. Housing has gotten so expensive across the country, particularly in major urban areas, that it's just becoming really impossible for young people to find adequate housing after they age out. Without housing, it's really difficult for them to do all of the other, what we think of as developmental tasks associated with this transition to adulthood. So if you think about it, if you don't have a stable place to live, how can you go to school? How can you find a job? How can you hold a job? All of those kinds of things that we think about as happening during this transition period. So I really think housing has got to be a priority for this population. There are actually a couple of federal programs that provide housing specifically to this group of young people. So one is the FUP program, the Family Unification Program, and the other is the FYI program, which is the Foster Youth to Independence Program. Both of these are HUD-funded programs, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and they're very similar. They both provide young people who've aged out of foster care and are either homeless or at risk for homelessness with vouchers that they can use to rent apartments in the private market. One of the challenges with these vouchers is that they only last for 36 months, which might seem like a long time, but when you're a young person trying to become economically self-sufficient, 36 months is really often not enough time to do that. Another challenge with these vouchers is that they're often difficult for young people to use. Landlords are hesitant to rent to young people who don't have a rental history or a credit history. Landlords sometimes discriminate against people who have vouchers. They don't want to rent to people who are receiving some sort of government assistance for their housing. And then finally, I'll just say that it's interestingly enough, in some communities, there are more vouchers than there is demand, and they can't find young people to take the vouchers. And in other communities, there are long waiting lists. So there seems to be some sort of mismatch between where the vouchers are and where the need is.
Is that mismatch, is it geographic?
Yeah, so there are some states where they have way more vouchers than, it's actually not states, it's communities. These are community level programs. So there's some communities where they have more vouchers than youth who need them, and other communities, like I said, where there are long waiting lists.
And I'm curious, have you looked at the stigmas associated with these federal programs? I mean, you talked about landlords sometimes discriminating, but then there's also the use or uptake of these federal resources. Is that a challenge too, that folks are embarrassed, young people are embarrassed?
I don't think that's so much an issue with this population. I don't think they're reluctant to take the vouchers when they're available. I think the bigger challenge is not being able to use the vouchers once they have one.
Got it.
The voucher has an expiration date, so if you can't find housing before the voucher expires, you no longer have one.
Yes. So it sounds like the 36-month cap is really problematic because it's not always realistic.
Right.
And then you also brought up just a broader challenge around basic needs, and housing is kind of fueling some of the patterns you see at the college level, right?
Right. Yeah. So we know, for example, that there's, a non-negligible number of college students who don't have a stable place to live, which really makes it difficult to focus on your studies, right?
Right. Absolutely. And you've studied yourself the nexus between homelessness and the foster system.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like sometimes we separate students like, oh, you're housing insecure or you've been impacted by the foster system. Why are we doing that? What's the logic behind it?
I think we do it because our social service system is very siloed, right? We have different agencies that have different responsibilities. So we have a child welfare system that focuses on investigating families when there's allegations of child abuse and neglect and caring for children in foster care. We have housing agencies that focus on housing. We have a homelessness system that does homelessness services. They're all very siloed. And so I think that that's part of the reason why we think of these as very separate problems when they're often very interrelated.
Absolutely. Let's dig in a little bit more into college access. So FAFSA, there are new proposed changes to the FAFSA form for college-age foster students, or eligible, I should say. How does that impact that pipeline of young people who are even entering post-secondary institutions?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges with the FAFSA in the past is young people haven't understood that they were supposed to check the box.
Mm-hmm.
There was always a box that had some wording that was supposed to sort of be a flag for young people if they had been in foster care to check, and that would potentially make them eligible for various programs or benefits. And I think that they were not always aware of that.
Got it. Okay. That's the federal application for federal student aid. FAFSA always just rolls right off your tongue.
Yeah.
But it sounds like we still have a highly decentralized way of providing support to young people who've been impacted by the foster system. Mm-hmm. State by state, campus by campus, community by community.
Correct.
And it sounds like it becomes very hard to create an integrated or coherent system when that's the current model, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we've danced around your research, around policy, around kind of the pressing issues for today. Like, what's one thing, Dr. Dworsky, you want listeners to understand from our conversation? And you've been in this space as an expert for students experiencing homelessness, the foster system, looking at students who've aged out, the foster system, looking at post-secondary implications. But like, what's the one thing you want listeners to understand?
So I think what people need to think about is these are young people who the state removed them from their homes when they were children, brought them into foster care, and actually acted as their parent, in essence, for however long they were in foster care. And now that they're leaving the child welfare system and are out on their own, think about what you would provide to your own children, right? Mm-hmm. When your own children turn 18 or 21, do you suddenly say, okay, I took care of you and now you're totally on your own. Good luck. Have a great life. Don't come back for me for any support. That's not how we typically treat our own children. And so why do we do that to young people who've been in foster care? Why do we suddenly expect them to be totally self-sufficient and make it totally on their own at age 18 or 21 when we don't expect that from our own children?
Wow. You're highlighting the double standard really we have for young people who've been impacted by the foster system. Well, Dr. Dworsky, Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago, a national expert on young people who've been impacted by the foster system, especially college-age foster youth who have aged out. It has been a real pleasure to speak with you today, and we appreciate you for lifting up our student population that often does not get lifted up. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Coming up, we'll hear from Liz Squibb, a firm believer in bringing foster youth and families, the true experts of child welfare systems, to the table. The Center for the Transformation of Schools partners with the education ecosystem to change school systems through research, practice, and policy to support more equitable outcomes for historically underserved students. We'd love to keep the conversation going with you. You can reach us at ctschools@ucla.edu. Among Us is sponsored by the Stewart Foundation, a family foundation dedicated to improving life outcomes for young people through education. CTS partners with amazing and vital organizations to promote change in our schools, like this one.
Hi, my name is Angelina Saul, and I'm a program officer with the Conrad and Hilton Foundation. The folks who have experienced the foster care system have a lot of very wise, smart things to tell us about how that system treated them and where they ended up immediately after leaving that system. And I think it's important for listeners to know that when I say that, I'm talking about almost 75% of youth who age out of the foster care system, leaving it without true permanency, right? So I think it's important that we listen to those folks. And I would encourage anybody listening to this podcast to really stop and ask yourself, how do I consider and center lived experience in the work that I'm doing, whatever that work is?
The Conrad N. Hilton Foundation is a financial supporter of the UCLA Center for the Transformation of Schools. Our next guest, Liz Squibb, discusses the importance of meeting basic needs and exploring innovative approaches to help families move from surviving to thriving, like a guaranteed basic income. Liz started serving foster youth at the Annie E. Casey Foundation over 20 years ago, where she helped launch the groundbreaking Jim Casey Youth Opportunities Initiative, which aims to improve life outcomes for transition-age foster youth. During her time at the foundation, she helped develop the Jim Casey Fellowship Program that was designed to equip foster youth to become advocates and change leaders in their communities. In the late 90s and early 2000s, the program was cutting edge for its time for integrating young people with lived experience into decision-making spaces. Liz Squibb now works at the Center for the Study of Social Policy, which utilizes community action, public system reform, and policy change to reimagine supports and services for children and families to thrive. Let's hear more from Liz Squibb in her conversation with Dr. Bishop.
Liz, grew up on a working farm, played many roles. You've had different leadership positions. Now you're at the Center for the Study of Social Policy. Tell us about that transition and even how we come to our conversation today. How did you end up here?
Great question, and thank you for having me today. My journey into this work began about 2 decades ago in 2001, so I'm aging myself a bit, when the Annie Casey Foundation and Casey Family Programs launched the Jim Casey Youth Opportunities Initiative. And this was intended to be just a 3-year demonstration aimed at improving outcomes for transition-age youth in the foster care system. And at that point, that was a largely invisible population, right? We just wanted to make sure kids didn't die, right? And once you reach 14 or 15, folks felt safe. And so they were a largely ignored population. In that initiative, it's still going today because we showed that if you give more attention to this population and provide more opportunities, they're going to do better. So in that role, I had the privilege of leading the youth engagement portfolio and playing a pivotal role in the development of the Jim Casey Youth Opportunities Jim Casey Fellowship Program. And that fellowship program was designed to equip young people with lived experience to become more powerful advocates, think about them as trusted advisors, and really catalysts for change in the communities, but more importantly, the public systems that they understood intimately. And again, as a small side note, in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, it's important to remember that at that time, people did not recognize that young people lived with lived experience in foster care were the true experts in navigating systems. So this kind of fellowship and policy engagement was truly cutting edge at that time, dare I say. And foundation support was key to the fellowship success. So Annie Casey and Casey Family Programs, they were willing to submit the kind of fellowship that allowed folks to dream and think about what we could do. And we rightfully named that fellowship after the founder of UPS, Mr. Jim Casey himself.
What did you learn in that process, though, in working with young people to elevate their voice and to do something which at the time, as you said, was cutting edge, but today we're like, well, yeah, why wouldn't you do that, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think at that point, folks were willing to provide money, flexible dollars to do that kind of work. You know, there weren't organizations that were doing the thought processing and the thinking with folks. They were providing direct service. And what Foundation Dollars allowed us to do was really to play around to see if we could truly bring young people to the table, build their scaffolding, build their capacity to do so. And so, you know, we're at 25 years now. I mean, I'm proud to say I played a role in that kind of inception and still doing it to this day, but learning how to do it better and better each time.
And when you talk about young people with lived experience, say more for listeners.
I think there's some definitions that folks like to throw around, right? Transition age youth in foster care, aging out. And so when we talk about young people with lived experience, I want to start with what it means to be a transition age youth, right? Or an older youth. And those terms usually refer to the young people who are in that critical process of transitioning into adulthood, right? From adolescence. And that stretches about 16 to 25 for your typical young person. And there are a lot of developmental changes and challenges that are happening as they navigate towards independence, right? If you've got two parents, one parent, but you've got a support system. And neuroscience will tell us, right? Those brains are still developing. But when we talk about transition age youth in foster care, those are the young people with lived experience. And unfortunately, that particular group is slightly younger. And those are between the ages of 14 to 21. And they're doing the same thing, right? They are moving to adulthood, but at the same time, they're preparing to leave foster care or they've already left foster care. They're forced to navigate the challenges of independent living while still trying to figure out education, employment, healthy relationships, with the trauma and the unique experiences that come with being in foster care. And so those are our lived experience group. And unfortunately, they age out of the system. And that usually means typically between 18 and 21, they've reached the age of majority for services and supports.
And this notion of aging out, there's this assumption that now you don't need services, now you're ready to go. Where does that come from?
Again, I think a lot of it is because the system's just not set up to be the parent. And that's what folks are doing, right? If we're saying that parents aren't able to take care of their children for abuse or neglect, then there are folks that feel really good about making the hotline phone call. Okay, the police came up, everything's got to be fine. The reality is they're now in a system that pretends to be a pseudo parent and they just can't. It's a bureaucracy and it's not set up for that. And so what happens is you've got folks that aren't going to pay for services for a 21-year-old, right? Somewhere along the line, folks believe that 18, you're an adult. And we certainly don't think a 21-year-old needs more support, but we know that isn't true, right? I have a 24-year-old that sometimes I wonder about his decision making. So there is a need for that. But I think when you're asking folks to put federal dollars, state dollars, and you're asking folks to consider a 21-year-old a young person, people have a hard time with that because at 18, you get a vote. At 21, you get to have adult beverages. And so I think they've lost the concept that these are still transition age young people that most of them, their frontal lobe isn't developed. And we know that it's backed by science. So I think what happens is folks have just decided, and we've grouped this group of young people that are over 18 as adults.
Do you think there's political convenience in the process of determining when young people get services and don't get services?
Well, I mean, that's a loaded question. So, yeah, I think, it's convenient to use the age as, we're not going to take care of a 22-year-old. We might if they're still in school or they're working. We might do some extended small services. I think the reality of the way these systems are set up, these systems are historically racist. These systems really were just set up to disadvantage people of color, just to keep them away from resources and supports. And so, it's easy. It's easy to do that. And it's also easy to create poor policy, to just say that we've got policy.
How are you trying to change the rules of the game for young people in your current role?
I've got a great place to be at the Center for the Study of Social Policy. I'm going to say CSSP because it's such a long name, but it's just the way we do our work. Our mission is to create a just society in every way, racially, economically, socially, and so that all children, all youth, and families can truly thrive. But to get there, we have to acknowledge the hard truth that racism has shaped our policies and systems from the start, and that those systems still actively harm people of color and folks with intersecting identities like sexual orientation, gender identity, their ability, and even immigration status. So I think what we do at CSSP that's a little bit different is we're not just talking about being not racist, we're actively anti-racist. And that means working to reimagine those systems and to make amends. So it's not just thinking about it, we got to make amends. And we do that by partnering with communities, leaders, public systems, and most importantly, and the thing that I get the joy out of and have, get to do a lot is including the children, youth, and families that those systems touch. So we have about 4 guiding principles that keep us focused on the right way to do the work. And everybody at CSSP implements those across our work.
What's, I think, really innovative about your work is that you are guided by the expertise of young people and families who help you conceptualize and shape your policy and kind of organizational agenda. I'm curious, are there examples of young people and families who've helped you kind of think about these guiding principles in different ways or have pushed you to be more effective in your role as a leader in the field?
Yeah, for sure. And these principles have been here before I got here, but the way that we do our work is centering those most affected by economic and health injustices. We've got a anti-racist underpinning in all the work we do. So I'm confident that these guideposts were developed alongside things we learned along the way, because CSSP has always engaged children, youth, and family in their work. I think the step up is asking them to do it with us. So we've got young people that have told us that in order to heal the wounds of racism that have been inflicted, that means we've got to recognize the policies that are still impacting young people today. One of the other things, we work a lot with parents that are in poverty, and they'll tell you the child tax credit that helped them for 2 or 3 years is no longer there. So those were meeting the needs of children, youth, and families of color. Now they're not. When they say to us that $400 check helped make sure that, one, I could bring food to the barbecue, which meant I get to be in community and I get to be with my people. So it's those little stories that they'll tell you that, there it is. That is why it's important for us to continue to have a guaranteed income for parents or even young people, which is what we're pushing for in our policy agenda, because it allows you to be in community. It allows you to do the things that you need to be whole.
Tell us more about the idea of a guaranteed income for young people.
A guaranteed income means that we're providing a meaningful amount, right? That there's a benefit that's set that's going to allow young people to live, that they're automatic, right? There's no strings attached, meaning you don't have to be in school or you don't have to be in a trade. There's like $1,000 cash demonstrations going on around the country. And so what we're seeing is those things are helping people. They're not getting rich by any means. But what it is, it's making sure the lights don't get cut off. It's making sure that a young parent, and we've got a parent that's an ambassador that works with us, who told us, this allowed me to do things with my children that I couldn't. I got to do vacation. I got to do things that I typically wouldn't because we're stretched from bill to bill. So a guaranteed income for young people means the same thing that it meant, the child tax credit meant for parents in poverty, right? It just means that we can make it through and might have a little extra. Or we buy better food. Maybe we're not going on vacation, but now I can shop at Whole Foods. I can get the fresh foods. So it's that kind of stuff that a guaranteed income will do. It just allows people just to live more freely.
How do we help change perceptions or even narratives around these ideas of federal policies and our state programs that really help young people and families just, to your point, show up at the barbecue?
I think that is usually a racist view, right? That is usually a white supremacist view, that if we create it for all, then it'll help everybody, or it's siloed for certain populations. I think what we need to do is reimagine that supports and services should help everybody, right?
Right.
Specifically, if I'm just working on policies around young people in foster care, if I know that these policies will work for transition age youth in foster care, then they're going to work for transition age youth around the country. There's this notion that we've got to shift the policies and practices that we know historically are anti-racist, that are excluding folks with I-10 numbers. They're excluding child caregivers. They're excluding young people who are over the age of 21, but are still trying to navigate these systems. And there's a cliff all of a sudden. You turn 21 in the middle of your college semester, all of a sudden your supports are gone. How do you finish the last 2 months of your college semester when your supports are cut off, or your rent is it, and now you're leaving housing? So I think it's about shifting the way that we see the system as kind of this place where we go house folks or we provide these handouts. No, we're helping communities be better, reimagine, because that is where our people are. That's where young people are. That's where families are. They're in communities. They're not in systems. The system supports should only be there to help, not be the handout that they keep coming back to. And if we do it right, that systems and communities work together, then we're able to have a whole set of supports and policies and practices from systems, organizations, communities, and people.
That's a great summary. And it's been an honor to speak with you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bishop. I appreciate it.
There's a lot that we can do to better support this population of foster youth. Let's break it down. We must better educate foster youth, their caregivers, and school counselors on the FAFSA application process and the importance of checking the box on the form for foster youth to become eligible for special programs and benefits. We also need to increase the awareness of state and federal financial aid available to foster youth. We need to make affordable and stable housing a priority. Amy uplifted federal programs like the Family Unification Program and Foster Youth to Independence Program. But these programs are flawed. Time limits and expiration dates make an already stressful process that much more complicated. The vouchers only last 36 months, which is often not long enough for young people to establish financial independence, and landlords hesitate to rent to tenants using housing vouchers. Homelessness and foster care are addressed through two separate government agencies and are sometimes treated as separate problems, when in reality, these experiences are often interconnected. According to Liz, we need to have a paradigm shift in how we think about where people are. They are in communities, not in systems. Let's include people with lived experience as co-designers and co-leaders of policies, programs, and practices. Liz shared with us that many of the young people she worked with 20 years ago are now leading organizations themselves. Whether you're working with an organization on the ground, providing direct services, or a leader in the community, it's imperative that we collaborate and partner with those most affected by and closest to the services and supports, because they have the solutions. Transition age youth have a unique perspective. They have a deep understanding of the system. They have seen how the system fails young people, and they're incredibly resilient. And if we empower them and build their capacity to help design solutions and be systems leaders, it's not only the right thing to do, but it's setting ourselves up for a more equitable future, because these are going to be the leaders. This is Among Us. Thanks for listening. I'm your host, Geneva Sum. Among Us is a podcast by the Center for the Transformation of Schools in the School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA. Caitlin McAloon is the production coordinator. Elizabeth Wyndham is the supervising producer, and Julia Wyndham is the editor. The senior producer is Jay Woodward. Our theme music is Pillar by Shimmer. For more information about this week's episode, go to transformschools.ucla.edu. You can find all of our links in our show notes. If you have any questions or feedback for us, email us at ctschools@ucla.edu. And please follow, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. Among Us is produced by Windhaven Productions and Blue Jay Atlantic.